I'm here today to talk to you about bilingualism, which is something very, very close to my heart. Because I am bilingual, partly because I'm a speech and language therapist and I work in London, which is a very multilingual, multicultural place to work. And also it's something that, you know, in my profession and in my career, I've just sort of naturally just had this interest that was always, maybe because I'm bilingual myself, people always latched at me at work. I was the only, I work in a monolingual, all-white, female-dominated speech and language therapy service in Hackney. And so whenever there was another child, which of course there are many, who don't speak English, everybody would sort of come to me asking me, expecting me to know the answers, which obviously I didn't. But what's very interesting is when I qualified many, many years ago, we had no training in working with bilingual children. And as soon as I got my first job, you know, I would have a caseload of 60 plus children, and there would probably be like 2 or 3 monolingual children, and the rest were all bilingual. So everything you had learned sort of went out the window. It was like, but what do you do with this child? So I've been on a journey, and I think I'm still on a journey. So thank you for my very nice introduction, Anna-Marie. But I think I'm still always learning about bilingualism. Okay, so as part of my job, I work as a speech and language therapist, a clinical lead in a London borough for the NHS. And the other part of my job, I run my own practice, which is called Speech and Language Lab Limited, where I provide assessment and therapy for children and young people till the age of 25. I provide training and consultation to a range of services, areas, settings. But one of the things that I started about 5 years ago is this campaign, which I've started to call Say Yes to Bilingualism. And that campaign is really something where wherever I can, I will drop off my leaflets. Wherever I can, I try and get a stall to run some drop-ins, and I do fun days. And if there's like even a fun fair, so the local fun fair that runs where I live, I'm always there with my little stall promoting bilingualism and multiculturalism. So it's something that I spend a lot of my spare time doing because it's something that I feel very, very passionate about. And so today I'm going to give you a few stories through the evening which relate to things that have often come up in my stalls or my workshops or where I run these drop-ins. So what are we going to get out of today? I hope that you will all go away, and you may know some of this already, I'm sure, but I would like you to really know the difference between EAL, so English as an additional language, and SLCN, speech, language and communication needs. I want you to really be able to understand that there are different types of bilingual children. So we talk about monolingual children and then we talk about bilingual children, but really when we talk about bilingual children, we need to start thinking about the different types of bilingual children. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory. So I'm not going to go too much into the research, and I'm not going to be too theoretical, but I would like to talk a little bit about the theory around bilingual language acquisition, because I think in order to truly believe that bilingualism is not a problem, and in order to truly believe and to really mean to a parent that, do you know what, it doesn't matter, speak your home language. And even if your child has autism or cerebral palsy or speech and language delay, you know, it really doesn't matter, carry on speaking your home language. To really believe that message, I think you need to know the theory. And I'll be very honest, being bilingual, knowing that it's not a problem, in my very early years of my career, I would tell parents, you know, it's okay, speak your home language, speak your home language. But when I would be working with a child who, let's say, has autism, is pre-verbal, doesn't have any words yet, my priority was never to make sure this parent continues to speak to their child in their home language. My priority was around eye contact and turn taking, and I'm not negating any of that. That's all very important. But if I be honest, I think deep down it was always such a barrier, such a challenge, such a mountain to climb to be able to get an advocate in the room, talk to this parent, explain to them why I'm using PECs, that often I maybe really didn't involve that parent into decision making as much as I would have done for a monolingual child. I made the decisions because, of course, you know, this is what we're going to do. We're going to use symbols because that's what we do. Had that been a monolingual family, I would have asked them a lot more questions. So I guess around the theory, what I'm going to say to you is that you need to know the theory so that you can teach the theory to the parents. You're not going to spend hours teaching the theory, but you are going to make sure that when you are working with a parent, they really do believe you and they understand you as to why they need to speak their home language. I'm going to share what I feel are my top tips of working with bilingual families. I'm going to touch on cultural competence and just kind of invite you to think about yourselves and about your service or whatever remit you work in. How culturally competent are you? And then I hope, the whole evening is inspirational, but I'm going to leave you with some ideas about things that I've been doing that you can also do. And I guess some of those aims, I hope, resonate with you. And I'm aware that Jersey has a limited EAL service to nursery-age children. So hopefully we can together bridge some of that gap. Okay, so our first aim, knowing the difference between EAL and SLCN. So we have a bilingual child, a child that speaks, let's say, 2 languages or doesn't speak English. And you carry out an assessment in whatever remit you are, as a speech and language therapist, a SENCO, a family worker, an assistant, a nursery worker. In whatever remit, you carry out your assessment of that child, and you find that their home language skills, their L1 skills, are good, but their English skills are poor. So home language is fine, but English is not so good. Now for that child, we would typically say that the nursery or the school, they're sort of responsible for helping them to develop English because they're an EAL child. If you do your assessment in whatever remit you work and you find that they don't speak any English, they speak another language, but that other language that they speak isn't really where it should be, it's poor, or that you find that their home language skills and the English, so they do speak some English, but that's also poor, then that would be suggestive that they need speech and language therapy. A speech and language therapist needs to see that individual. Because I guess what I'm trying to be clear on here is that if home language skills are fine, but English isn't, that's the job for an additional language teacher, the school and SENCO, to support English. It's not a problem, they just need to learn English. The other side, there's a language learning problem. There's a problem acquiring and learning both languages. And that would typically be the role of a speech and language therapist and others. So I'm going to run through a few quick questions just to kind of sum up the night really. But is bilingualism a problem? And I'm sure that you all will agree that bilingualism in itself is not a problem at all. But bilingual children, of course, can have speech, language and communication needs. What language should parents speak with their children? The home language, absolutely. Parents should be speaking the home language, and not just for the reasons of learning language, but actually not speaking the home language is disruptive for cultural and your identity. And I'm just going to share a little something with you there that when I was growing up, my parents spoke between themselves, they spoke Punjabi. But to us and my brother and my sister, my parents spoke Urdu. So Urdu and Punjabi are 2 languages, similar but 2 different languages. And I remember my mum, as I grew up and going through school, would come home and my mum actually would say in English, no English in this home. So my mum was, she was a working mother. She spoke English outside in her workplace. We would come home and she would often, speak to us in English and should sort of shout at us and say, don't speak English, speak Urdu, because she was so worried about us losing our home language. Now, I don't advocate for that at all, but I never really understood that. And even, when I was at university, I remember talking to my mum and she would speak English, and I'm like, just shut the phone now, I can't be bothered. But, now as a mother, I am so desperate for my children. I'm like, gosh, I want them to speak Urdu and I want them to maintain that. And I worry, I'm a fluent Urdu speaker. I can read, write and speak Urdu. I can read poetry. I write poems in Urdu. So I'm very, very fluent in Urdu. But will my children be? That's a worry for me because I speak a lot more English than my parents did. So that's just something to bear in mind. Is code switching okay? Code switching is where you switch between the 2 languages. Absolutely. Code switching is absolutely fine. It's a normal process for bilingual children and adults, and it's nothing to be worried about. And it's something that actually shows a fluent bilingual. Now, just to show you some code switching, I'm going to show you 2 videos. Now, the first one, they are in Urdu, so you will hear English, of course, because it's code switching between Urdu and English. Are there any Urdu speakers here? No, you won't understand what's being said, but I just want you to hear the difference between the 2 videos.
ये भी कर दो, दूसरा फिर भी कर, ये भी साफ कर.
करो साफ.
Thank you, bete.
Thank you, bete. Thank you, son.
ये भी करना सा.
Okay, so there are words, of course, for thank you and for door in Urdu. This wasn't an intentional thing, but the speaker has just switched between the languages. Very normal. Now the next video is also code switching.
Fast. So उसको mix करो अच्छी तरह.
Mix.
What are you making, Ibrahim?
Cake.
Which type of cake?
Chocolate cake.
और केक के अंदर क्या डाला आपने?
Chocolate.
और?
Chocolate cake.
हाँ और क्या डाला? चॉकलेट डाली और क्या डाला था?
Butter.
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 और?
Chocolate.
Butter and?
Butter. Dessert.
Sugar. And? Cake. Oh!
So you can see a lot more code switching, sentence, whole sentence in English, and lots more. At that point he dropped it, the thing. Okay, right. So should parents stick to using one language? There seems to be this thing around that where you have parents speaking two languages, they need to kind of stick to one. And what I've told you from code switching, you should now understand that actually you can't stick to one, because code switching is very typical for bilingual speakers. So no, you shouldn't. You shouldn't stick to one language. For us as professionals, it's confusing that there's two languages going on. For the bilingual speaker, it's not confusing. For the child, it's not confusing. So the research actually shows that suppressing one language in bilingual children is more effortful in terms of an inhibiting process rather than alternating between languages. It's a bit like if I said to you that you can talk verbally, but non-verbally you mustn't use non-verbal language. Now I'm using my hands all the time. I'm looking at you. So for me to talk and not look at you, not make eye contact, not move, not use my body language would be really, really not very helpful, and you would all switch off. We understand that really well. So when it comes to speaking two languages, it's exactly the same thing. If you inhibit one language, say don't use that one, just speak this language, it actually is more of a problem than helpful. Yep. Does learning through both languages confuse bilingual children who have language difficulties? So we're talking about now a child who has a speech language communication difficulty. Is it going to confuse them that we use two languages? Absolutely not. Offering more ways of accessing meaningful communication encourages language learning. When you have a child who has a speech and language communication need, we very much say use visuals, use body language, make sure you've got eye contact, use pictures, use props, use sign language, use Makaton, and talk. We promote that for all children, and that's exactly what we should do for all children, regardless of how many languages they speak. We should be promoting speaking as many languages as the home has in it for that child that has a speech and language need. So even if the child, like I said earlier, even if the child has very severe speech, language and communication needs, something like autism, cerebral palsy, or very significant language difficulties, you still shouldn't be saying, let's just go with English. So, I would very much advocate for, if you were going to use visuals even, or, picture cards with English words written underneath, like a cup, with a cup written, I would go to putting the word cup in the home language. That child can't read cup anyway. They can't read CUP. But why are we not putting it, why are we not writing it in French or Turkish or Portuguese or whatever? So it's about really promoting. And when you start doing that, you will start seeing parents start saying, you know what, actually there's something special about my child, because this practitioner has gone out of their way to promote my language, and so now I'm going to believe her, and actually I'm going to stop lying and say that I do speak the home language, because I don't, and I'm going to start speaking the home language because there's some truth in this. Okay, moving on to our next aim, so understanding the types of bilingual children. So I'm just going to run through what my definition of a bilingual child is, and I use the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists definition, which I love because it's so broad. So the Royal College says that individuals or groups of people who acquire communicative skills in more than one language, they acquire these skills with varying degrees of proficiency in oral and written forms. And so a child should be regarded as bilingual regardless of their relative proficiency in the languages that are used or understood. So by that definition, there'll be lots of bilinguals in this room. You may not be very fluent in, whatever you did for GCSE or A-level as a foreign language, but if you have some of that language still and you can use some of that and you understand some of that, you would be classified as a bilingual. Okay, and now we're going to talk about groups of bilinguals. Now, children become bilingual for different reasons and in different contexts, and we know that. In the UK, we tend to use 3 groups to sort of populate children into. The first is what we tend to call professional bilinguals, and Sean has touched on this earlier. So this tended to be children of diplomats and professional, very business-like people, where there is no threat to that language, because let's say that this family travels back, I don't know, to France, you know, every weekend. Dad works in France and then comes over on the weekends, and or you know, there is absolutely no threat to that language to survive. It tends to be languages that have more social status as well. Bilingual families refers to typically where mum would speak one language and the other partner would speak another language. So actually there's 2 languages between the 2 carers. Typically that's what a bilingual family would be referring to, where there are 2 languages being spoken in the home. And linguistic minorities, as Sean has already touched on, this is the largest group and tends to be the group of biggest concern in the UK. So there's a threat. There's a threat to their language, because often these families have come into the country for, you know, a better life, and so there is a desperate need by these families and these parents for their children to do well academically and economically, and so often those parents won't speak their home language, or the parents don't know English, so they will try to learn English, or they will just sort of make do as much as they could. So these are sometimes the families who say to you, you know, it's okay, I know I want to speak English, or yes, I can speak English fine, no, I don't need an advocate. This is the group of children that we tend to have the most concern about. Okay, so they're the groups. Now I'm going to talk about the types of bilingual. Now there's 5 main types, but really today I'm going to touch on the top 2, but I will just quickly skim through what each of the types are. So a simultaneous bilingual, as the name suggests, is a bilingual child who is acquiring 2 or more languages at the same time before the age of 3. So perhaps this may be, you know, Turkish is being spoken in the home by mum or dad, and that child has been going to nursery straight away, like 8 months, 9 months, 1 year, and English is being spoken a lot. So they've got Turkish and they've got English. This could also refer to Turkish and German, 2 languages being spoken at the same time in the home. So two languages acquired before the age of 3. A sequential bilingual, as the name suggests, is where the second language is being acquired after the age of 3. Now this requires a completely different process of learning, as you probably can understand. Children are already using the knowledge that they have of their first language and the knowledge that they have of communication to acquire that second language. So if, for example, I'm a bilingual child and my home language is Urdu, before the age of 3, I only spoke Urdu. I'm a sequential bilingual, so I know that this thing here is called kursi. I know that it has 4 legs. I know that it can come in fabric and leather. I know sometimes it has a back, sometimes it doesn't. You can sit on it, you can stand on it. I know lots of things about this thing, which I map all of these things to the word kursi. When I start after the age of 3 to acquire English, I see people saying, oh, pick that chair up, put that chair there. I hear that word, and then I say, oh, okay, so what I need to do is just learn that kursi equals chair. I don't need to relearn. My brain doesn't need to relearn that I can stand on it, I can sit on it, it comes in fabric, leather, it's got 4 legs. I don't need to learn that. I'm already using what I know, and I'm just mapping it to the new word. The other thing, of course, about sequential bilinguals is they don't need to relearn that you have to have eye contact, that you need to show interest. They already know those things about communication, that we take turns when we talk. So they've got a lot of knowledge about communication, and they've got a lot of knowledge about their first language, which helps the second language. So there is research that shows that actually sequential bilinguals are more likely to, are better bilinguals. They're more likely to retain their home language, which is interesting. Okay, passive bilinguals refers to where you have some monolingual preschool children. So you have a child, let's say, who speaks Polish in the home environment, and they have, you know, direct exposure to their home language, to their Polish, but they've got passive exposure to English because they have a sibling who goes to school, so he's often speaking English. Or they see TV, they're watching CBBS and they're picking up English from the TV. We see lots of them, don't we? We have an additive bilingual. Don't see much of this, but this is where you have positive effects on the home language because of learning the second language. So this again tends to be for those professional bilinguals where the home language, let's say French, is even more advanced because of the English. So it's where a child says to their mum, very unlikely, it's not a good example, but I can't think of something else, but it's where like a secondary age school pupil who speaks French, let's say, comes home and says, Mum, you know, in science we used a Bunsen burner. How do you say Bunsen burner in French? That sort of thing. Yeah, so the French is actually getting more and more better because they acquired a second language. A subtractive bilingual we do see, and this is where it tends to be an immigrant child is almost really forced to give up their home language because the second language is not yet mastered. So you may have a child who speaks Polish as the home language and they haven't acquired that Polish very well yet, but they stop speaking that Polish and they keep speaking English. And we see lots of this. And it refers to the negative effects on the home language because of learning English. It's almost like saying that they didn't learn enough Polish to learn English. And when we look at the theory, you'll understand that more. That because Polish wasn't promoted by all the people that interact with that child, or that mum gave up speaking Polish, that actually English has this overwhelming effect on the children that they stop speaking the home language and they continue to speak English, but then they don't speak English very well. Or they, at a conversational level, they may speak English well, but they don't do very well academically because the English language is not as, their vocabulary, for example, is not as advanced as a monolingual child. Yeah? Okay. So over to you, very quickly. I'm only going to give you a minute for this. I'd like you to quickly, really, it's for you to do in your mind, but you can have a chat, I'm sure. Think about children that you work with and what, now that you know the types and the groups of bilingual, what type of, think about one child and just think, what type of bilingual are they? Okay, so moving on, and we're going to talk about the theory now. Okay, you do have more time to talk. I'm not going to do this as a group activity. If anyone can shout out, this would be really helpful. I want you to think about your experience of learning a second language. Does anybody mind being a little volunteer and just running through these answers so that everybody can hear? Can we have somebody who has learned a second language in any form, in any remit? You're not going to have to speak that language, I promise. You can see the questions. Yes, thank you. Sorry, what's your name?
Sam.
Sam. So what's your experience of learning a second language?
School to A-level studies.
School to A-level studies. And what language?
French.
French, okay. So so you started to acquire French at roughly?
Started about age 7.
Age 7, okay, so sequential bilingual. Until? 18. How did you learn it?
Only in lessons in school context, but also 3 weeks immersion at a French family when I was about 11.
Okay, no French being spoken at home?
No.
Okay, no travelling back to France?
No.
French friends?
No.
Okay.
No friends.
Okay, no friends. you didn't have to disclose that. Okay, and who else was involved? So I presume just your teacher?
Teachers and classmates.
Yep, teachers and classmates. Was it enjoyable?
Yes.
Okay, good. Always enjoyable?
Yes.
Exams?
Yes.
Enjoyable always?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No.
Okay, that's fine. You could have said yes. That's fine. So very academic teaching. Yep. And then we could say that where you were with a French family for a short while, that was slightly more social.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Can you still speak the language?
Yes.
Very good. Very good. Good. Excellent. So I guess hopefully by running through that, you can see in your heads if you're thinking about yourselves. There's so many different aspects that we need to think about whether a family, a child is going to maintain and retain that language or not. So if it's being taught academically, it may not be enjoyable. For many children who speak another home language, they come into the school, English, it's not enjoyable. Or that very much, their association with the language is so stressful. It reminds them of, like being in an environment where they don't understand what's going on. So I guess what we need to think about is, your experience of French is a very positive one. Somebody else could have gone through the same thing and be, oh my gosh, I absolutely hated it. That teacher was awful. I never revised for that. I just, forgot about that subject altogether. It may be a very different experience. So just something to bear in mind. Okay, so we're going to talk about language acquisition, and we're going to start off by looking at simultaneous bilinguals, where two languages are being acquired before the age of 3 at the same time. What happens theoretically is that a child has one vocabulary system. So there's two languages being exposed. So let's say English and French are being exposed to this child under 3. They only have one vocabulary system. So they will be using languages from both. They'll be using words from both languages. So often as a nursery worker or a support worker or whoever you are, you may say, oh gosh, they're using words from both languages. Are they mixing the languages up? If they're under 3 and they're a simultaneous bilingual, that's very, very normal. They will be mixing languages up. Then what happens is that they distribute the words into two separate vocabulary systems. So the child acquires and learns that this is all French and this is all English. But what they still have is one grammatical system. So they'll still make grammatical errors. So often you see this, like in Urdu, you might hear, I often in Tower Hamlets in London, we hear children saying, cake I want to eat. Oh, no, sorry, cake want eat. Wait, this is a disordered child. No, it's not. It's a child that's simply using their home language grammatical system and mapping it onto English. Very, very normal. So already you can see that as soon as you have a child, let's say that they're a simultaneous bilingual, the first thing we should be doing is working out what's the grammatical structure so that we know, is this disordered, is this normal? Yeah. So at this stage, they've got two vocab systems, but still one grammar system. And then by about 3 and a half, that's when they have two grammatical systems. So at that point, they should be, they're still learning language, of course. They're still learning vocabulary, still learning grammar, but they've got two, they should be a good speaker in both languages. I'm going to talk a little bit very quickly about exposure and input, which is really quite important when you think about bilingual children. So some things to think about is timing of exposure. This child that's just arrived in your nursery, have they just come from a war zone? Have they just arrived in this country? Is mum here but dad hasn't arrived yet? How did they come into this country? Is the timing of the English that's being subjected on them, what's the story behind the timing of English starting at this age? Context for learning L2. So are they siblings who speak English? Are they the only child? So actually the only exposure that they're actually getting is from your setting. Form of language. So they may be a sequential bilingual or they may be a simultaneous bilingual. Mum and dad may speak English, but what's the context? What's the form of the language? Is the English that the parents are speaking, is that good? Yeah, is that well-spoken English? Or actually are they getting a slightly watered down version of English? The amount and type of exposure. Does the family have other friends and family close by? Do they link up with other community groups, or are they quite isolated? And the type of input, which is about form of language. And then of course language status. Many parents don't tell you that they're bilingual or won't tell you all the languages that they speak. So if you say to them, do you speak English? They say yes. Are there any other languages spoken? Oh, not really, just English mainly. But actually they're on the phone to their mum who's, I don't know, in Poland every day, or they're Skyping, or there is other things going on usually, but it's our job to find out about what that is if the parents aren't telling us. Now there's a link here which is also in later on in the slides. I'm not going to show it to you, but it's a really nice YouTube link about people talking about their experiences of their parents speaking broken English, and it always causes a few tears, so I'm not going to play it, but do watch it later. It's a really valuable thing, a lesson for us all to learn from that. Okay, so continuing with the theory, I'm going to talk about BICS and CALP. BICS refers to basic interpersonal communicative skills. So that really is everyday communication. Hello, goodbye, being able to just get by, the basic communication. CALP is the cognitive academic language proficiency. It's the more competent communication. It's the communication that's needed to survive, to get through, to do well at school and in institutions. So everyday communication. In a bilingual speaker, you can get, when a child is exposed to that new language, let's say English, by 2 years, you would expect that individual to get everyday communication. They should be able to get that. But it takes up to 5 to 7 years to become a competent communicator in that language to achieve CALP. That's the language that's necessary for day-to-day living. That's the language that's necessary to really understand classroom content. So you'll see that sometimes children go through the early years, go through primary school, and at secondary school, all of a sudden this child is huge of concern to everybody. And it's probably because actually they haven't acquired the competent communication in English. Context is very much reduced in everyday in competent communication. So everyday communication, you have so many cues to help you. As a competent communication, the CALP, it's very much context reduced. You don't have so many visual cues. Everyday communication, cognitively undemanding. You can order, when you go abroad, you can order lunch, you can do that. Can you have a political conversation when you go abroad in a language that you don't speak very well? Not really. So just a little diagram there to show you the quadrants. So something that's very cognitively undemanding and the context is embedded, talking with friends. Really, it's undemanding and it's embedded, the context is embedded. Let's look at the bottom right quadrant. Context is reduced and it's cognitively demanding. Standardized assessments, thinking about content in classroom, maths. Yeah, very abstract and it's more challenging. Let's think about speaking one language now. So if you speak one language, that's your everyday communication at the top. That's what you can see, you can get by, normal communication. What you can't see is the competent communication. Yeah. So everyday communication develops in about 2 years. A competent communication develops in about 5 to 7 years. Let's look at 2 languages. So I've got my home language, and there's a common area here, the CUP, the common underlying proficiency. Now, there's a common area of language proficiency which provides the foundation for the use of both languages. Now, this is the research that is what we need to know to believe that it's really important to speak your home language, because that will help English develop, that will help the second language to develop. What you can see from this is that the second language is actually growing from the foundation of the first language. So there's your first language. You need to have your competent communication, your CALP, which is the bottom, which you can't see very well. You need to have that in order for your second language to develop. Does that make sense? Yeah? So the stronger the first language, especially the competent communication, the stronger the second language will be. Yeah? So what does this mean? We often overestimate a child's everyday communication and not realise that actually they don't have that competent communication. A very good example is if you think about your own Makaton or Sign Along or Signing or BSL, you probably can sign cup, but could you sign Bunsen burner? So that's the more competent communication. Okay, so simultaneous bilinguals, very quickly, they're acquiring 2 languages. We've talked about this. The child mixes the languages to start with, then the child separates the languages, and then unfortunately in simultaneous bilinguals usually there will be one language that is stronger. There's always one language that is slightly stronger in simultaneous bilinguals, and that's because English usually takes over as soon as the child starts school. In sequential bilinguals, we've said that they already know about the home language and they just need to map those words onto the second language. So what's important here is that it takes about 3 months for the child to understand the second language. That's quite a long time. So as soon as a child enters and they haven't been exposed to English, we need to give them some time just to settle and to start to understand English. It takes about 2 years to have a good conversation. And it takes about 5 to 7 years to think in that second language. Now, I'm not advocating to say that we should wait until children are 7 before we do anything. Of course, you're looking at all the other things as well. But that's just something to bear in mind, that it's a slow process. So the process of a sequential bilingual is they come into the nursery, they speak only their home language, and they continue to speak their home language. Then they realise that this isn't working because people don't understand me. So there's a non-verbal period, often called the silent period. That's where they're soaking in the new language. They're soaking in English. They stop speaking their home language as much as they did. Then they start to have telegraphic speech. They start to use some English. And you know, how quickly they move is depending on the child's personality, the context, depending on us, how we respond. Then they start to have productive language use, and then they become a competent language speaker in English. just a few notes about silent period. I mean, you probably know this all, but I guess something just to think about is selective mutism. A child who's going through the silent period is not a child that's not communicating. They've entered the nursery and they should, a child that doesn't have needs, a child should enter the environment and they should speak their home language, because that's what they know to communicate. They should be speaking their home language. When the silent period happens, they're still interacting, taking part in circle time and communicating, looking at you, taking turns, because they know all of that. That's communication. They're just not using English. That should be the silent period. If there's other concerns around communication, of course, that's alarm bells. And research, this is always very controversial, but the research suggests that the silent period could last a year. But now people are saying we should wait 6 months. I'm not wait 6 months for referral. If you need to refer because there's other alarm bells, of course. But if you're talking about, a child that doesn't have any other communication needs, sometimes they can stay silent for about 6 months. And when the name is slightly misleading, they're not completely silent. They can be, but they will start to use words as they become a bit more confident. So we tell parents to use their home language because by parents providing good language models in their home language, they're more able to use language in creative ways. They can sing in their home language. They can share those nursery rhymes that they grew up with. If children develop a good home language, a good foundation in their home language, they will be more able to learn English. And we've talked about the research. And mother tongue is so important for identity and a sense of community. So, very quickly, on your tables, you have a few case studies. Now, just to let you know, I'm only going to give you a few minutes. I'm going to stop you very quickly. The reason for that is because I've purposely only put very limited information there, because you should be saying to yourself, well, actually, I can't tell you what I would do next because I need to know X, Y, Z. This is just to get you thinking about what you've learnt so far. So just have a quick run through that. We're going to run through these together quickly. So let's go through the first one, and if we could have some people volunteer their thoughts, that would be helpful. So we've got the first one. Ahmed, aged 2 years, has just arrived in the country and has started nursery. He's only using a few words in Arabic and spends a lot of time watching other children. So what type of bilingual? Do you want to shout out? Simultaneous. Would you be concerned or not? Yeah, from what you've been told, doesn't sound like anything at risk at the moment. What would you do next? Wait and see. So I guess you shouldn't have this thing in your head that, oh my gosh, bilingual, I need to have alarm bells, I need to be super observant, because there's no reason to be super observant over that child compared to a monolingual child. That child at that stage just needs to be monitored, as does any other child, yeah? Okay, so number 2, Kristin has been at nursery for 2 terms and is not saying much apart from hello and bye. He seems to point or reach to things he wants. What type of bilingual? Oh yeah, sorry. That was on purpose, by the way. So yeah, you don't know what the home language is and you don't know whether there's more than one language. Okay, that's fine. Would you be concerned or not? Sorry, say that again. Would you be concerned? You need more information, but just from what you've been told, do you think you'd be concerned? Yeah. So I guess the reason I put that in there, I wouldn't want you to be waiting that long that this is a bilingual child, so let's not worry. Yes, of course, 2 terms. I would, if they're only saying hello and bye and they've been at nursery for 2 terms, there is so much repetitive language in nursery, so they should definitely be saying more than hello and bye. And of course, something useful to know would be, are they using home language in the nursery? A good thing is that he's pointing and he's reaching to things, but he isn't using any words for those things that he's pointing to. So just keep an eye, I guess.
If there's no bilingual support for that child within the nursery, there are no peers who speak their language, there's no member of staff that can, that child is very isolated.
Absolutely.
The chances that they even be able to demonstrate what they knew and understood.
Yeah. So, and you've just said exactly what you would do next. So if that child's been at nursery for 2 terms and isn't saying much apart from hello and bye, is reaching for things, the next step would be to say, okay, well, let's support this child. So I would do something I would start, putting a little bit of extra support for this child to see how do they respond to that support. So I'm not going to leave this child alone, because 2 terms and only 2 words is a bit concerning. So I would put, in whatever remit you can, I would put a little bit more extra support, see if I could get somebody to come in and have a look at the home language, find out more information from parents. That would help my decision making. Okay, number 3, Mia speaks Cantonese and English. In nursery, she mainly uses English, but will sometimes use Cantonese words. She makes a lot of grammatical errors in English. What type of bilingual? So I haven't told you, she's in nursery, so let's presume she's 3 or under. Sounds like simultaneous because she's learning English and Cantonese. Would you be concerned? No. As long as you've checked that the grammatical structure is the same, yeah? What would you do next? I guess it depends on what your other answers to the first 2 questions are, but you need to keep an eye. Number 4, Shiri's home language is Twi and French. Mum speaks well in Twi at home. She's been in nursery for 1 term and is not talking. She's developing well in all other areas. So what type of bilingual? Simultaneous, so Twi and French. Would you be concerned? Doesn't seem, from what you know, doesn't sound concerning. What would you do next? No extra support because they're bilingual. Treat them like you would treat a monolingual child. No extra supervision, but just as much observation and looking out for that child as you would for a monolingual child. Okay, Adrian is from a Spanish-speaking family, but is mainly using pointing and gesture to communicate. Mum continues to use English, which is very poor, despite nursery staff telling her to use her home language. What type of bilingual? So just speaking Spanish. So if they're under the age of 3 and they've just at nursery going to be exposed, then simultaneous. But if the child is over 3 and is then learning English, then it will be sequential. Would you be concerned? Yes, definitely. And what would you do next? Yep, advise mum to speak. So give mum some support to know that it's okay to speak the home language. Potentially onward referrals, extra support, visuals, strategy, all that you know that you would do with children with language needs. Okay, so moving on to giving you some of my top tips. I just want you to shout out, think about a time, let's all think about a time that we went abroad and we didn't speak the language. How do we communicate? Think about your holiday, your last holiday where you didn't speak the language. How do you communicate? Absolutely. Okay, so we do lots of things, right? We do a lot of things. What actually helps us? So we communicate, and what's interesting is we all laugh at that. We do things that help, and we also do things that aren't helpful. So how many of us will speak louder? Which way is the hotel? We speak louder, just thinking that would work. It doesn't, but we naturally do it. I mean, we do it with our husbands and wives. It doesn't work, but we think it works. So that doesn't work, but we do those things. What does work? Pointing, gesturing, showing, look, here's the address, using other people, using props, using everything, that helps. We know that. And I guess this is a good way of thinking about working with children who are bilingual. You've got to do all the things. You don't understand this child, that child doesn't understand you. You've got to make every effort to do everything you can in your capacity to help them to understand what you're trying to say. So just because mum says he likes water doesn't mean he shouldn't be offered milk. Just because he went for apple the first time doesn't mean that we offer apple every time or he likes apple. Why not? If we ask that monolingual child apple or orange, why are we not? That monolingual child always takes apple, but we always ask apple or orange. So we should always ask the bilingual child apple or orange. I'm sure you do. I'm just trying to give an example here. Okay. So how can we help bilingual children? We can help bilingual children in the same way that we help any child that has speech, language and communication needs. The way that we interact with the children, the way that we provide opportunities to learn language, and the way that we optimize the environment. Now, these are 3 ways that I've just categorized. What I want you to do is on your tables, you've got post-it notes. I want you to write down all the strategies that you use to help children who are bilingual, but also children who just have language needs. So children who have speech, language and communication needs. I then want you to put each of those post-it notes onto your A3 bit of paper. You've got 3 A3 papers with those headings, the way you interact, providing opportunities and environment. I want you to stick your strategies onto the right bit of paper. This activity is, if you think about the headings, it becomes quite difficult. If you think about, okay, so what's the ways in which we interact, or how do I provide opportunities? It sounds a bit hard, it's much harder to do it that way. It's much easier to think, okay, what strategies or what do we do with children who have speech, language and communication needs, or we're concerned about them? And to think about all those strategies, and if you jot them all down, you are able to group them into these 3 things. I'm sure there'll be no strategy that doesn't fit into one of these headings. So I'm just going to move on now and go through some of this. So the way we interact, now I haven't put everything down, I've just put what I think are my top tips. So to support children to understand us, to support receptive language, really important, we do this all the time, we get their attention first, we use their name, touch them, nudge them, make sure that we've got their attention first. We use simple language, we use gesture. To help the child to talk, to help the child to use expressive language, we copy their words. So they say something in their home language, we say it back. They say something in English, we say it back. We expand on what they say. They say car, we say red car. We use specific praise. We say, great, that is an apple. Yes. They say tat, we say, yes, good boy, it's a cat. That sort of thing. So let's just do this quickly, adding words. So you're playing with a child who's playing with a car. They say car. How are you going to expand that? Brilliant. You've just swung, I don't know why, I must have been doing this way too late at night. I don't know, I've used this slide for years and I always say I need to change that. I don't know why you would swing a child around, but you've just swung the child around. And you say again, the child says again. So what would you say? Yeah, swing again. I need to change that. Child hands nursery worker a doll and a dress and says, You say, doll. Perfect. Child is just about to blow some bubbles. They say bubbles, you say, yeah, I feel like that, you say, I can't remember that game, you know, the TV program, anyway. Child is feeding Teddy and says din din. Dinner. Child finishes eating chicken and says chicken. Chicken finish, yummy chicken, whatever. Yeah, great. Simplifying language. Think about your sentence length. Try to chunk information. Give instructions in the order that you want them to be done. Avoid the tricky vocab. Avoid idioms. So use literal language. Slow down your pace and use repetition. So let's do this together. Before you line up for lunch and get your coat, make sure your chair is pushed in, the pencils are in the pots, and the books are put away on the shelf. And that's, I haven't made that up. I record in classrooms with consent, and that's actually what one teacher said, and she couldn't believe it. You know, she felt really embarrassed, but that's what she said. So how can we simplify that? Yeah. Yep, and I can see people using body language, and there's so much language that doesn't need to be used. Make sure, don't need that. Pencils are in the pots, the books are put away on the shelf. There's so much extra things. So you can simplify, you can chunk, you can wait for them to do something, let them finish it, then do the next thing. You know this. Okay, we all know some simple questions, what, where, who, nice and context embedded. Difficult questions, how, why, when, what if, which. They're the ones to avoid or the ones to think about a little later developmentally. Providing opportunities, I'm sure you do this all the time. Get involved in the child's play, model new ways of playing, comment on what the child is doing, talk about what you're seeing. You're like a sports commentator, you're commenting on what they're doing. Don't preempt what the child wants, wait for them to ask you or to show you. Offer choices, don't have all the toys out at once. Child needs to ask for what they want. Create opportunities to take turns, we know that. Adapting the environment, we do this again all the time, and this is what to think about when you're abroad. What do? You use pictures, photos, symbols we can use with kids, objects, pointing, gesture and miming. For older children, mind maps and colour coding to help them understand. Why do we use visuals? It's so much easier to remember, easier to make sense of than a string of joint up sounds. It shows the child what they need to focus on. They are concrete, they're permanent, it doesn't go away. And children are less reliant on visual cues. visual timetables. So why do we use visual supports? We use visual supports to help children to learn words. It helps independence, it helps them to understand rules, it helps them to attend and focus, it helps them to understand instructions, processing that more complex language, the abstract language, helps them to understand emotions, it helps them to prepare for change, it helps them to understand routine. We all know that. I'm going to give you a few questions to think about. We're not going to talk about it now, but just want you to go away and think about this. So cultural competence. Cultural competence is made up of cultural knowledge, having the knowledge of the culture that the child belongs to, being sensitive about that information and actually being aware of that. And that's something really important. I feel, people say I know a lot about bilingualism, but my cultural competence will vary depending on the child that I see. I still come across children and I say, what language, what's the home language? And I've never heard of it. So my knowledge and my awareness and my sensitivity is, completely different to if I saw an Urdu speaking child. So just think about, is your service accessible for all the speech and language therapy? I think there's a speech and language therapy manager here, there's nursery managers, Senkos. Think about, is your service accessible? And is it appropriate to the children and families? Are you as a service or as an individual expanding your knowledge, adapting your resources, creating new resources to accommodate the needs? Do you value and promote cultural differences in the way that in whatever service or setting that you are? And do you continue to access training and support? So a few things to inspire you. These are some of the things that I do. So we run language groups in minority languages. I think we have an SLT assistant and a bilingual assistant in the room. So we use bilingual assistants and we run language groups in Polish or in whatever language we need. We run language talent days to really promote language diversity. We do parent drop-ins, which I've told you about. Sharing home videos, ask parents to bring in a home video, watch it together with the class. Culture of the term, we promote a culture and we learn about it and we celebrate it. If you're a manager in your more managerial aspect, carrying out a service review, running joint community events, celebrating festivals, bilingual parent show and tell, so getting the bilingual parents to come in, supporting them, but helping them to come in and promote their language, to share something with us, a bilingual storytelling session. Have you got a policy? Something worthwhile. So this is some of the things that I've done. Language of the month, multicultural lunch, that always goes down really well. Multicultural day, so really promoting all the children coming in and we're learning about different cultures. Interactive bilingual storytelling session. And just to finish off, there's some links here that please do go away and look at these links. I'm not going to show them to you because I'll go way over my time, but they're really fantastic. The top one is London SIG Bilingualism. It's I used to chair this SIG and it's got so many resources on it that you really must take time to look at that. It will have lots of resources that can help you. Newbury Park Redbridge School is a wonderful website where there are children who speak different languages saying words in their language, and there's downloadable resources, which is wonderful, as are the others. Just to finish off, I would like you on your tables to, on a post-it note, to write a target for yourself. Just one target for yourself that you, after today's session, you are going to go away and achieve. So it's got to be achievable. I want you to write it twice. So you keep one post-it note, the other post-it note, you write the same target, but at the back of the post-it note, I'd like you to put your email. And in 3 months' time, I will email you a photo of that post-it as a reminder. So we do this a lot. It's called YOC. So it's wonderful to be at training sessions, but I've done this as well, where you go on a training session and you come back and you haven't done anything because you haven't got the time. So what I want you to do is write your target, and I'm going to help you by emailing you that reminder that this is what you promised yourself to do, and who's going to benefit? The children that we work for. And I'll leave you to do that. And on that note, thank you very much.